This is the history lesson for March 19th. It's Thursday, so I trust you're able to keep up as much as possible. And I understand you've got homework assignments from other classes. If you're not watching these daily, hey, I get that. That's not a problem. All I ask is that you do watch them seriously. So make sure that you're able to devote some attention to this when you finally get around to watching them. So if you watch, 2 or 3 in a day to catch up, not a problem. Just like I said, do your best to pay attention, to give it your best effort at actually understanding the material. So let's get back into it. We've been discussing World War I. We have dealt with the beginning of the war, 1914. We've dealt with largely the events of 1915, and we've kind of we've hit some of the battles. So let's pick up at that part of the story. 1915 saw a number of offensives accomplish nothing. We've talked about that, how fruitless the attacks were. It involved thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes even 1 million men on both sides, and it resulted in almost nothing. There was no change. The defense in depth, as it was called, was so significant and so powerful that the cost just to gain a few hundred yards was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. So the defenses were just overwhelming. It was really at 1915, at current military thinking, there was no way that things were going to change. It was just going to be a vicious long-term fight. Every offensive led to a colossal loss of life. And so for 1915, in April, so remember, we still have largely during the winter months, battles die down, weather and other conditions sort of preclude the ability to fight. So spring was the beginning of the offensives. And usually every year there was some form of spring offensive, usually several of them. So with spring of 1915 in April, we saw the Second Battle of Ypres. We'll say second battle, and there's actually going to be a third battle because there's no change in the lines. They keep fighting in the same places over and over again. So the Second Battle of Ypres was the first large-scale use of poison gas. We discussed yesterday what poison gas was, what it did. It was launched in artillery primarily. And early on, the sides just weren't prepared for this. And both sides used it. Both the Central Powers and the Allies used poison gas, mustard gas, chlorine gas. It could be either debilitating, meaning caused blindness, often permanent, and sometimes it was just lethal, especially in sufficient dosages on the battlefield. Men would just die. And it would create this cloud of death that would linger over the field even after sometimes the fighting had largely died down. The other major change that the Second Battle of Ypres brought was the arrival of the Canadians. So the British, at this point, are still calling on their Dominion to provide troops. That includes the Australians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, the Indians, and the Canadians. And so the Canadians, by April 1915, they're able to arrive in force. I'd point out the Canadians have been fighting World War I quite a lot longer than the Americans, because by 1915, we are still a ways from the Americans joining the fight. The Second Battle of Ypres was, like the rest of the fights, largely inconclusive. It did nothing. This is what it looked like, though, to be on the battlefield and to watch as the shells explode, releasing poison gas. These clouds that were created were fatal. So it wasn't necessarily the risk of being hit by one of the shells. It was the gas that was left behind and was floating over the battlefield that was so destructive. And so this is going to, what one side does, often the other side does as well. And so both sides very quickly adopt the use of poison gas, and that adds an entirely new danger to the battlefield. Incidentally, the environmental impact is significant with all, not just the poison gas, but everything else. We'll talk about some of the long-term results, but this is destroying the land as well as the people. Though many died, the line moved very little. It was measured in yards, hundreds of yards. Now, the other change in April 1915 was on the opposite side of the world. It was the Gallipoli campaign that was launched in earnest. So the Gallipoli campaign was an attack on the Ottoman Empire down by the Black Sea, down by near Istanbul, or what used to be Constantinople. And it was an attempt to create a new front. It was an attempt to sort of kick in the back door and come at the Germans in a place that they didn't expect. It was the idea of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. We were introduced to him yesterday. He was one of the key figures, along with Lord Jackie Fisher, in preparing the British Navy for World War I. Winston Churchill is a fascinating human being, one of the most interesting men of the last 500 years. He was born of a British father and American mother. He was a child of two worlds and kind of not of either, although he was British. That was his heart, his home, but he had a deep love for America. He was a brave man. He had been a soldier, a reporter, a historian. He had escaped the Boer War, which he'd been reporting on by boarding a train and fighting off those who were trying to capture him with a pistol. He was just kind of an Indiana Jones in a way. Just wherever the action was, you could always count on Winston Churchill being there. Well, as First Lord of the Admiralty, he was in charge. He was essentially the liaison between the government and the Navy. And he had the idea that if the Allies tried a naval landing in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, it would knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. That was useful. But more importantly, it would open up a new front on Germany, which would compel Germany to send troops, which would take those troops from either the Eastern or Western front, and they would ease the pressure on Russia. Because 1915, it was obvious that Russia was under some severe stress as a nation, not just as a military, but the entire nation was reeling from the destructive results of World War I. So at the Battle of Gallipoli, the Navy failed to gain the strait. And what I mean by that is it was essential that they control the waterway that links the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And it was going to cost lives. The strait was mined, meaning that it had a bunch of bombs that are essentially stationary, and if a ship goes near them, they explode. And mines were massive in their destructive power, much more so than battleship shells, or at this point, even torpedoes. A single mine could and did sink a battleship. Now, what probably should have happened, and this is the advantage of hindsight, is the Navy should have just charged. Even in spite of the damage done by mines, even the ships sunk. Had they done so, they would have knocked out the Turkish forts, and that would have allowed a different outcome. But as it was, the Navy failed to gain the straits. They were not able to destroy the Turkish forts, and since the forts remained, the line held. The landing was a devastating failure, and the surviving troops had to be reloaded on transports. It was a major defeat and a blow politically to Winston Churchill. He was in fact demoted. He lost some of his position for it. Strategically, it was creative. It was kind of thinking that there should have been a lot more of, but tactically it was a failure. So let's maybe look. So this is an overhead view of the location, the battle of what will be the landing at Gallipoli. So to give you an idea of what it looks like and how it works, here was the strait right here that I was telling you about. It was necessary for the Allied forces to be able to enter the strait. There were significant forts that were armed with large guns that were surrounded by concrete here and here and here, and these forts needed to be destroyed, even if it cost battleships. The Navy was not able to do so. This entire place was mined. There were several ships that did charge in. They exploded and sank. What should have happened, quite honestly, is just continual pushing. Ships needed to be lost in order to gain this overwhelmingly important objective. However, the ships pulled out. There were several landings of men. So the main British forces, they land right here. The main French forces, they land here. And very importantly, the Australians and the New Zealanders, they land here. Initially, they were able to push the Ottoman forces back. But in each case, you'll notice that there were some significant obstacles for the success of this venture. Let me point them out. So as the Turkish forces fell back, they are able to retreat to a fortified position here on a mountain. And when you have the high ground, that's a massive advantage. Over where the New Zealanders and the Australians were fighting, once again, you have the mountains. And because of the advantage of the grounds, because of the forts, because of quite honestly, just the fact that everything was holding for the Ottomans, this eventually led the Allies they were forced to call off the Gallipoli landings. And so all the men had to be reloaded on transports. It was a major failure. Nothing was accomplished, but a lot of lives were lost. And so there was political consequences and military consequences to it. Now, once again, as an amateur armchair historian, I would say this was the right idea. And in retrospect, had the Navy committed even more resources and had the Navy been willing to endure the losses of what were primarily pre-dreadnought battleships. They weren't the most useful ships, although there were real men on them. But had the Navy pushed the straits and gone through, this would have compelled the soldiers here to retreat, because the ability of the naval forces to be able to shell them from this angle, it would have been deadly. And had the Allies been able to take this entire area, what would have happened was they would have had now a front. It would have driven the Ottomans out of the war. It would have allowed them to open up a new front on the Austro-Hungarians. It would have compelled the Germans to send probably a million or so men from the eastern and western fronts into the south to be able to shore up this position. And it quite likely would have led to the salvation of the Russian government. And it may have opened up opportunities on the Western Front to simply overwhelm the Germans by just the number of men. This is all speculation, though, because it doesn't happen. And because it doesn't happen, we're left just to wonder what could have been had everything gone through, had they forced themselves in, and had the outcome been different. We'll never know. So this was the Gallipoli campaign. It was a very creative idea, and it was an utter failure. It's a shame it couldn't have worked. For the rest of 1915, both the Allies and the Central Powers, they did launch offensives. Both were continuing to use poison gas, but by this time, gas masks had become a common issue. So as if life in the trenches was not already miserable enough, now men at all times held gas masks by them, and as soon as the call went out, they put it on. And so you wore a sweaty, uncomfortable, leather-lined gas mask with couple little holes for goggles that would last for hours and sometimes even longer, just trying to survive. The offensives that were launched in 1915, they involved 1 million men and unmeasured firepower. The amount of shells, the explosions was just tremendous. And they accomplished nothing. Over and over, both Allied and Central advances led to nothing other than death. Another couple million men died or were wounded in 1915, and the lines at the end of 1915 are shockingly similar to the lines at the end of 1914. This is not, World War I is not the tale of great battlefield conquest and of glory. It's the tale of endurance and human foolishness and evil. On the Eastern Front, so back when Germany was fighting against Russia, von Hindenburg, who, remember, we introduced him, he had been called out of retirement to stabilize what was a dangerous development in Germany when the Russians had some early advancements, but he was very successful, surrounded and destroyed a large Russian army. Well, he launched a minor offensive to relieve pressure on the Austrians. The Austro-Hungarians were unable to cope with the pressure that was on their side. And what he intended to do was simply launch an attack in order to distract attention from the Austro-Hungarians, give them time to refocus their lines and to resupply. But his attack, though it was intended to be a sideshow, turned out to be a stunning success. He was gaining ground. He was actually claiming territory. No one was claiming territory. This was not only a German success in the sense that they were achieving something, it was German success in the terms of propaganda. So German newspapers were able to show pictures of their side actually accomplishing something, battlefield, tactical, strategical. They were getting things done. He continued to ramp up as he saw the success develop, and so the offensive grew. By the end of 1915, the Russians had lost hundreds of miles of territory, and the nation was in serious political trouble as well. So the Western Front, it's not changing, but the Eastern Front was changing, and it was not changing in the Allies' favor. Russia was giving ground in large chunks, and as we pointed out earlier when we looked at the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of Russia's most important territory is far to the west, which is exactly what Germany was now claiming. And that's a problem. It's taking in Russian people, Russian resources, and this is destabilizing the nation politically, not just militarily. By 1916, Germany had changed strategies. So several top generals now believed the war could not be won on the battlefield. They had launched enough offensives. They knew that there was no way they were going to be able to overwhelm the British and the French and just conquer territory. So they came up with a new strategy, and that was attrition. They wanted to bleed France white. So the goal now was to do whatever it took to kill as many of the enemy soldiers as possible. So the strategic objective ceased being the taking of land. the taking of strategic towns, the taking of whatever territory was necessary. Now it was whatever was necessary to kill as many people as possible. Sometimes that meant offensive, sometimes that meant defensive positions. But regardless, it was all about death. This was a deadly strategy for both sides because in order to kill British and French, it was going to mean the loss of life of Germans. And entirely honestly, the German high command had determined this was a worthwhile trade. They were willing to kill their own soldiers for the opportunity to kill the opposing side. The most important thing for Germany was at the end of the battle, if they lost 500,000 men, that the Allies needed to have lost 750,000 men. As long as the other side was dying in greater numbers than they were dying, that was a successful trade-off. That I'm not saying it's the first time that had ever happened in history, but in modern history, this was a major change in strategic objectives to actively seek just to kill instead of any other objectives. That's a new, we're in a new place, and that's going to have a lot of consequences for both sides. So in February 1916, the Germans launched the 10-month-long Battle of Verdun. The French Marshal Pétain, he realized very early in the battle how serious this was, what Germany was trying to do. And when I say attrition, I just told you how much Germany's trying to kill. This doesn't mean that they weren't seeking to take land. They still were. They wanted to take as much land as possible. They just they believed that at this point, it wasn't going to be a battlefield victory that was going to lead them to ultimate victory. It was going to take a lot of death on the side of the Allies. So the French Marshal Pétain, who is now in command, he realizes this is a big deal, and it's time to commit the reserves. Both sides go all in. So he ordered men to stay, even under a massive artillery bombardment. Commonly what had happened is when the artillery started launching, men would retreat to trenches that were farther behind the lines, let the artillery bombardment burn itself out. Then when the artillery bombardment was done and the opposite side, in this case the Germans, were charging across no man's land, you reassume your position in the forward trenches and you begin shooting them down. Pétain realized how big this was, and he ordered his men to stay, which resulted in massive casualties. I'm not saying it wasn't the right tactical decision, but it was a very deadly decision for most. The Germans kept pushing. In fact, they were trying to make their advance as close to the artillery as possible. Usually there was a very carefully arranged timing. So let's do a little bit of a sketch here. Let's do an overhead sketch. If we have, here is the Allied lines right there. And here is the German lines. And in the middle is no man's land. So usually what you would do is at first you would call forth for the artillery bombardment. And all along here, there was going to be explosions that were coming from your cannons. Then there would be a time in which the artillery bombardment ceases. And when the artillery bombardment ceases, that was when you sent your men to charge, because you did not want your men to be killed by your own artillery barrage. Timing was everything. Usually, there was a safety net built in of a minute or two to protect it. But in this case, you had the idea of a barrage in which the men were trying to time it directly so they would arrive as soon as the barrage ceases. That is a dangerous game. Sometimes a cannon shot goes astray. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long, sometimes the timing's off. And so not only did you have the Allies, the French in particular, stay within their trenches and endure all that is happening, you have the Germans charging while it's happening. And this is going to create the Allies to respond with their own artillery barrage. So now in no man's land and near the front lines, you have German shot, you have French shot, and everything is an absolute meat grinder in which men are dying by the hundreds and by the thousands. As I mentioned, they were dying thousands per day. It's estimated at the very beginning that it's some of the hours men may have died by the thousands in individual hours, which is just a stunning thing to think about. In June of 1916, the Allies successfully stopped the advance. So the Battle of Verdun was not done by any means, but at least the claiming of territory, that stage, was now done. The French were now under command of Robert Nivelle. So for the rest of the summer, the Allies, still at Verdun, began to push back. It was once again fruitless. A little bit of land changed hands, but there were so many levels at this point. There were so many different levels of trenches that it was absolutely pointless. The land is still scarred and done. This is what it looks like today. The grass has grown over. You can see every one of these essentially divots is where an artillery shell landed years before. Um, it's restricted who can travel and what you can do. There's still a lot of unexploded ordnance buried in the ground. If you were to bring a metal detector here, it would go crazy. You have to be very careful about walking in some of these old battlefields nowadays. In order to relieve the huge pressure on the French at Verdun, the British led the offensive at the Battle of Somme. This was the Somme. This is in July of 1916. So by July, Verdun had stabilized. The French were able to plug in the gaps, and so though both sides, German and France were committing still massive amounts of men, at least land wasn't changing hands. So the British had the idea is how do we relieve the pressure on the French? Well, we're going to launch our own offensive. So at the Battle of Somme, more than 3 million men fought, and more than 1 million men were killed or wounded. This battle had the significance of being the first widespread use of air power and the first use of tanks. Tanks, we'll talk about that. Tanks have been being developed for a while. Back in 1915, Winston Churchill, though he was in the Navy, he became excited about the possibility of tanks and ordered their development. Which, once again, Winston Churchill, we're going to keep seeing that name. The Army should have been thrilled with the idea of tanks. The Army should have led the development, but the Army was largely disinterested. They didn't see how the tank could be useful. They thought it was pointless, and so they largely ignored it. Winston Churchill, those in the Navy, through back channels, ordered the development of the tank, and it's a good thing he did. At the Battle of Somme, they were used extensively. They were extremely useful. At first, Germans opened their machine guns on tanks, and guess what? They had almost no effect. And so with the tanks, the British were able to penetrate deep into German lines. It also had a psychological effect as well. It was terrifying. People hadn't seen these traveling forts. They were armored. They had cannons out of them, and this is before the modern day tank. Usually there was multiple cannons poking out the sides. They almost looked like battleships on land in their own little way. Unfortunately, tanks were slow and they broke down frequently. And in the middle of a battlefield, it's pretty hard for the mechanic to hop out and suddenly repair the damage. So eventually, the Germans were able to call in artillery, and that destroyed the tanks. Unfortunately, the Army commanders were not ready for the success of the tank, and because of that, they were not able to exploit its use. And so at the Battle of Somme, they made huge advances, and then they lost them all, and it was war as normal. And in the future, the Germans and the Allies, as they both continued to develop tanks, they also developed anti-tank guns, and they also developed mines. And so tanks, once again, they became part of the army. They became part of a military force, but they lost their shock effectiveness. So you can see here early tanks, large tracked vehicles. They can go over everything, including most trenches. That was a big deal. And you can see here they had these side guns, very unique in the way they were built, but they were prone to failure, and they really needed to be supported by infantry. What you needed to do is send tanks with infantry close behind. The Army commanders just didn't understand that. It was too new in war to understand how to use tanks correctly. In fact, you can argue that nobody really understood how to use tanks correctly until World War II. Erwin Rommel, and then later George Patton, and over in Russia, Georgy Zhukov and other tank commanders like them really grasped the significance of this mobile warfare. Like Verdun, Somme left very little changed. The lines were still relatively unmoved. Both sides had claimed a little territory, but nothing significant, nothing strategic. 1916 was a discouraging and hopeless mess, and discontent was now spreading among both soldiers and the home populations. Neither side could see an achievable end to the war, and too much had happened for a simple ceasefire. Both sides had lost so many lives, they couldn't simply approach each other and say, let's quit fighting since neither one of us can win. And because of that, they were locked into this endless destructive cycle of just death, death, and more death. So 1917 was the year of major change. 1914, we saw all the German advances. 1915, nothing. 1916, nothing, at least on the Western Front. And the East, things were changing. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But 1917 is the year that World War I, if we can say, it breaks. It breaks in a couple of ways. First of all, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. So very early on, we talked yesterday that the realization was that Germany realized that both Britain and France were being resupplied by the United States of America. The USA was technically neutral. It technically had no political allegiance to either side, but economically, it was selling to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder were the Allies. And so they were providing food and sometimes even munitions for the British and the French. In 1915, Germany realized we don't want to anger the Americans. If we can keep the Americans out of the war, that's best for us. But by 1917, the situation had changed, and this was the stage in which both sides were sort of saying, hey, we'll do whatever it takes. So unrestricted submarine warfare, in which the Germans felt free to attack without warning anyone, including American flying vessels, it resumed. Once Germany did that, that is radically going to alter American public opinion. Into 1917, there were still many Americans who were probably pro-German. There were many Americans who were pro-Allied, but the majority of Americans were pro let's stay out of this. The vast majority of Americans had that deep sense of American isolationism. We're here, let Europe knock each other out. That's their problem. Europeans are awful. They're idiots. This is their fault. They can kill each other. That was the American idea. Splendid isolation. But unrestricted submarine warfare rapidly changes the opinion, especially in the Northeast, where so much of industry was based on the shipping industry. Then, in one of the most incredibly stupid decisions in history, the German foreign minister, a man named Arthur Zimmermann, he sent a telegram. He sent a telegram to Mexico. And in this telegram, on behalf of the nation of Germany, he made a promise to the nation of Mexico. If Mexico would invade the United States, Germany would eventually conquer the United States and give some of the territory back to Mexico. It was a lie. It was a lie in every sense of the word. It was a lie because Germany never had any intent on dealing with the United States. Germany never, and if Germany did, they were never going to give any of the territory to Mexico. They were just going to conquer Mexico themselves. It was stupid. It was foolish. It was also deadly because the Germans didn't realize this. The British had broken their diplomatic code. The British were reading all their messages. The British intercepted it, and the British made a brilliant decision. At the time, the Americans were trying to stay out of the war, and Great Britain handed the telegram to the Americans. But they also realized, when Britain did this, they also realized the American politicians were likely to hush this up, to forget it ever happened, to pretend it didn't happen in order to stay out of the war. So Great Britain did two things. Not only did they give the telegram to the Americans, they also published it in the newspaper. When the United States public read that Germany encouraged Mexico, which Mexico wisely disavowed everything, said, we want nothing to do with this, this is stupid. Mexico played their cards right here. But Germany had just an unbelievably foolish decision. America reacted as you would expect America react when somebody in Europe said, we're going to conquer you and take territory. America went full America. And so in April of 1917, America entered World War I. In early 1917, the American army was small, poorly equipped, and weak. In fact, in January of 1917, it is unlikely that the United States of America had one of the 10 most powerful armies in the world. It would probably have been ranked like 15th or 20th. And that changed in a matter of months. The United States instantly began training and arming literally millions of men. Boot camps formed all over the nation. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and then millions of American young men became American soldiers. Germany realized now that America had pledged in the war, the clock was ticking. It was going to take some months. It was going to take a while for the American military to mobilize. And it wasn't just the American military, it was the American nation. The American economy had now gone into an economic footing. Some of that was for the sake of the war. Some of it was because President Woodrow Wilson, one of America's worst presidents, was using the opportunity to become a little dictator, just an awful president. It was one of the worst. We'll talk about him later on. But regardless, this does make the American economy now devoted to the war, and everything is now turned on, and it's just a matter of time. The American economy, though the American military was weak, the American economy was not. It was the best in the world. And now that it had turned its attention to the war, it was only a matter of time till the American military was going to be also one of the most powerful in the world. On the Eastern Front, Germany, now realizing that time is ticking, they knew that they had to deal with Russia, and they needed to deal with Russia immediately. They needed to eliminate Russia. That way they could take all the troops currently on the Eastern Front and place them on the Western Front. So the prior year, 1916, Germany had smuggled into Russia a couple of men who had been exiled from Russia, including Vladimir Lenin. These were violent communists who intended to destabilize and destroy their own nation in the midst of the war. So in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, it brought down the government of Tsar Nicholas II. Russia disintegrates. The nation falls apart. Lenin immediately assumes a measure of control, not all of it, but a measure of control, and he signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. This ends Russia's involvement in World War I. Russia immediately withdraws. They give up massive quantities of territory and material and wealth to Germany, and Russia stops fighting. And at this point, Russia, it enters a civil war. So here is Vladimir Lenin. He is the leader of the Reds. He is a devoted communist. He has taken Marx's message to heart. He believes in revolution, and he believes a revolution needs to kill. There is no communism without revolution, and there is no revolution without death. That's the nature of Marx's writings. Marx believed in this class struggle. He believed in the proletariat and the bourgeois, and the only way the proletariat was going to rise is through violent means. And Lenin practices that. Sometimes people think that violence is not part of the socialist system. No, it's built into the system. It's absolutely part of it. You can't have socialism, you can't have communism without the violent revolution that establishes it. So Lenin comes to a degree of power. He leads the Reds in a civil war against the Whites, and this leads to mass slaughter on both sides. But the Reds, the communists are successful, and they take all of Russia and establish the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, collectively normally known as the Soviet Union. And they begin murdering millions of their countrymen because the meat grinder requires it. That's the nature of communist ideology, to destroy anyone who they perceive as bourgeois. And the question is, who is bourgeois? And the answer is anyone who has more than I do. And this leads to the slaughter of millions and tens of millions of innocent people. This also included the royal family, by the way. When Nicholas II had stepped down, he and his family were taken to a small village, and they were detained. They thought at some point they would be released. I believed England had put out the word that England would receive the royal family in exile and allow them to live the rest of their life in England. But Lenin and others ordered their execution. And so the Tsar of Russia, the Tsarina Alexandria, and their daughters and son were all taken to the basement, and they were all shot to death. This leads to the legends of Anastasia, Princess Anastasia. Some people claim to have been the lost princess, but no, she was shot in the basement with the rest of her family. This removes Russia from the war, and it also plunges Russia into not quite a century of brutality and of death and destruction under the socialist, under the communist, and all the evil that they bring with them. And we're going to deal with them extensively in the weeks and months ahead, simply because they're going to be responsible for so much destruction in the following years. In April 1917, the French commander Robert Nivelle launched the Nivelle Offensive. He had promised to end the war in just a matter of months. That promise had been made before. It had always been unsuccessful. It bogged down, and another 3,000 men were added to the casualty list, either dead or permanently wounded. In June of 1917, the Americans began to arrive. Now, they came in small numbers at first. Remember, at this point, battles were fought between millions of men. You know, the Americans arrive at 10,000 and maybe up to 100,000. They're not large enough to form their own army. They just form divisions within other bigger armies that are controlled by the Allies. The thing about the Americans, though, they were inexperienced. They did not know how to fight. There's a difference between learning how to fight in a practice camp and learning how to fight in the battlefield. They were inexperienced, but they were not yet jaded, meaning they still thought there was a chance in victory. They thought they were going to be able to do something. Whereas the French and the British, by this time, they were convinced that there was nothing to be done. So the Americans brought an enthusiasm that had not been seen in quite some time. At first, they took side roles, and the idea was that they would learn how to fight from the British and the French, who had been doing it for so much longer. In July, the stupidest battle of the war was fought, and it was the Third Battle of Ypres. And it was stupid because it was launched before the Americans could arrive in great numbers. There was no point. If they just waited, eventually the Americans would bring 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 million, maybe even more men. The numbers would be overwhelming if they would wait. It was controversial when it was launched. The soldiers did not want to fight it because they realized the Americans were coming. Let's just wait. But the high command gave the order, and so it was launched. It did nothing. 500,000 more men were died or permanently disabled. Total disaster. No reason for it. But this was the foolishness of the high on both sides. This is what the Third Battle of Ypres looked like. It looked like something from a horror movie because of just the destruction on the battlefield. The last major battle of 1917 was the Battle of Cambrai. It was the first mass tank attack. So the Somme had introduced tanks, and they had been used in every other place, but this time there were hundreds and even thousands. It was surprisingly successful at first, but the German counterattack took back everything. It also convinced the Germans that they had one more chance. So by 1917, the Americans had arrived. They were arriving in very small numbers, but by 1918, they were going to be here in force. And so the Germans came to the conclusion that in spring of 1918, they had to end the war. They had to go all in. So troops were arriving from the Eastern Front. Now that Russia was out, they were free up. So troops were arriving from the Eastern Front. Troops were staging throughout the winter of 1917 and early 1918 to prepare for what was going to be Germany's last main assault to see if they could potentially win the war before the Americans come and change the balance of power. And we'll pick up there tomorrow. So good luck. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.